Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Hey, well, welcome, Sean. Thanks for that rousing introduction. We got the countdown to Sean's wedding. It's coming up. You know, hopefully he's listening. Can't wait. It's in Cleveland, Ohio. But enough about him. He's not here today. We do miss him. But I'm here with John Chang. I ran into John Chang. You know, if you heard our last podcast live from Historicon, from Echelon Games, and he's here to talk about his game, Black Powder Red Earth. Welcome, John.
Hey, nice to talk to you, Mitch. How you doing?
Yeah, it's been a couple of weeks, huh?
Yeah. Historicon is an interesting show for us. It was a show that we were initially told might or might not be our audience, but actually historical gamers seem to gravitate towards what we're making more than your conventional folks that you might run into at, like, say, Gen Con. So it's been a good show for us. I mean, we're 2 years now we've done it, and then we do guest appearances at the smaller shows that they run in between.
You mean the Cold
War, Fall In, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think no Cold Wars this year.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard they're getting rid of it, which is a little bit of a shame because it was like 10 minutes from my house.
Yeah. It's maybe we'll come back, but before we talk about, because you'll be at the Nova Open in a few weeks, let's talk about Black Powder Red Earth. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your gaming background.
Okay, so me, I went to art school for photography and painting, and then promptly went into design using computers. I was right out of college in '95. I had the unique, what's the word? I guess you would call it. I was one of the unique few people who actually knew how to do hypertext code and use Photoshop.
I don't even know what hypertext code is.
It used to, well, that used to be how you used to make the it was the basic language that you would use to tell a browser how to display graphics on a page or text and things like that. Now you hear of XHTML, XML, whatever. I don't even do that anymore. But basically after 9/11, my career path changed kind of radically, and I started working in the national defense space a little bit, and from there, I ended up creating one of the first big trading companies doing what's called weapons manipulation and small unit tactics. The company was called Magpul Dynamics. I was one of the sort of plank holders there. And a couple of years later, I left there with one of the key leaders in that group, and we started a company called Haley Strategic, again focusing on weapons manipulation, small unit tactics, and my partner's background was force reconnaissance, and he had been a special operations contractor. His name's Travis Haley. You can look him up on the internet. I worked there for several years and did more and more work where we were designing not just training, but specialized equipment for different atypical units, if you will. And fast forward a couple of years, I had been running a small gaming enterprise at that point, and I wanted to focus more on that. So I stepped away from Haley Strategic in 2016 to focus on Black Powder Red Earth. And we didn't necessarily start at miniature wargaming. I've been very into miniature wargaming in the late 80s and early 90s.
You're gonna have to tell us what you played, man.
Back in the 80s, when it was the first miniature war game I really played, was Space Hulk, actually. And Space Hulk is actually one of my favorite games, the original version of Space Hulk. I spent many weekends with my high school friends, and that was the game we played. We had the Deathwing expansion. We eventually would play like Necromunda. It was like these sort of like smaller contained games. We had played games like Squad Leader. I know when I first met you, we had talked about that. We had played the original Squad Leader. we'd played a bunch of chit games, but like what I was most interested in was these infantry specific games, where you were really responsible for essentially anywhere from like a fire team up to a platoon. And I felt, I kind of fell away from miniature wargaming for a while because I don't know how to put it. It wasn't engaging to me. Like it got too big. And I don't want to say too fantastical, but like it just got too big for me. And by big I mean the scale of the game. Like it started to be much more about rules and much less about tactics. And I'm much more like I was originally like a big chess player. I love chess. And I felt like there are some very nearly perfect games out there. I have a very warm spot in my heart for Squad Leader, even though I was never that great at it. I really loved.
I've said in the past, it's not a game; it's a cult. But I don't want to interrupt.
Well, it's a brilliant system for simulating infantry battles in World War II. And I mean, concepts of how that designer John Hill, how he brought time together, like how he represented time in turns, was really impressive. And I still think it's one of the best turn-based systems out there. The main thing I wasn't a fan of later as I got like better at gaming was the you go I go thing. I like the alternating activation, like more like chess or Go or more traditional strategy games. I feel like the enemy always having a vote in what you do is a vital part of any kind of like close combat. And as to jump back to the present, we started looking at miniature wargaming again because someone who had used to work for me, his name was David. He had been an editor for me, and he had done writing for me with my gaming company. He was he's a British national, and he ended up going to work for GW. He worked on Shadow War Armageddon specifically, was one of the first big projects he worked on. And he called me up and he's like, I know you used to love 40K. Have you checked out the Shadow War Armageddon thing? It's kind of like Necromunda, and I know you like that too. So I was like, oh, no, I haven't. So I went out and bought it. And I'm like, wow, this is really cool. Like these, like, the kill teams, the orcs versus the Space Marine scouts and the Imperial Guard, sort of like veteran troops. I like that dynamic, right? Like I thought that was a really cool, and with the terrain and how it evolved, because in the older games, there were just these like flat tiles. You didn't have the sort of hyper detailed terrain that GW was able to produce in the past 10 years or so, I guess. I mean, I come from an era where White Dwarf actually used to teach you how to make terrain out of like cans and things like that.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a cool part of the hobby. That the only trick was back in the 80s and 90s. There were so few stores that had this stuff. Like it was very difficult to find, like basing and like good paintbrushes. I think when we met, I talked about Meyer's Toy Store, which is this family-owned toy store that had all these really esoteric games, and they had all these really cool Japanese die-cast toys that you couldn't get at like Toys R Us. But like that when that store went under in like the mid 90s, I really didn't have any place else to go to buy stuff because nobody else carried this stuff where I lived. It was difficult to find. And even working in New York City at that point, it was not the easiest thing to find stores that sold this kind of stuff. There's the Complete Strategist, but they seem to be much more of a board game focus than a miniature wargaming focus. And again,
you could get copies of White Dwarf there. That I know.
Yeah, oh for sure. And that was an exciting thing, right? Like that was a reason to go to places to get stuff. I used to go to Kinokuniya every 2 weeks when the new Japanese animation and gaming magazines and modeling magazines would come out, because Kinokuniya in Midtown would get the magazines from Japan. They got them like a couple weeks late, but you could get everything new. So you could go in and buy like Military Modeling Magazine or, God, I can't remember. There were all these weird esoteric magazines that they would get, and half of them don't even exist anymore. But like, there was like Hobby Japan. And then there were like these subset, they were like these subset things where people would invent these micro games around model kits that people were making. Of course, there was nobody to play with, and all the instructions were in Japanese. So it wasn't, it's kind of a high bar for entry.
I mean, it was a good reason to learn Japanese, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like
Yeah.
all of the most interesting gaming stuff in the world was happening in Japan in the like mid to late 90s. It didn't really start what's the word? It didn't really pivot back to the North America till after the PlayStation 2 came out. And I feel like there was this like huge like revolution in game, like people in America in general just like falling in love with video games and board games. Like, I can't remember when Catan came out, but I remember Catan was one of the first games other than Monopoly that my parents bought. And I was like, wow, you guys bought this game? Like, it, cause to me is, this whole German designer game thing. And I was
It
really
it
surprised my parents were into it, like they got it at like Walmart or something. I don't know.
it ushered in the era of, it came out in 1995, and it
Oh
ushered
God.
in the era of Euro games, yeah. It's still a
Yeah.
widely popular game, and, the guy that, designed it, I think he passed last year.
Oh, really? Oh, that's so
Yeah,
sad. He was like a dentist or something and made it to play with his family, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Let me go look. He died April of this year,
Oh, man. Well, I mean,
and he was a dental technician.
he made an incredible game. I mean, like Settlers of Catan is a game I used to play with my kid when she was growing up, and because you can play it, you can play it very. It's not like Monopoly where you kind of have to play it mean. You can play Catan a little bit more, a little bit less aggro if you want to. And there was I liked how many different ways there was to win in that game. I thought it was a very creative game, and certainly opened my eyes to like designer games from Europe. I know I picked up a bunch after that, like oh god, Carcassonne, like Puerto Rico, all these games that I would have never picked up, but I
I've
enjoyed
played
Catan.
Carcassonne.
Carcassonne's great.
Yeah, but I'll make an admission now. Actually, most of our listeners know this. I've never played Catan, and
Oh,
I've never finished a game of Monopoly.
oh wow,
I know,
yeah,
there's something wrong with me.
yeah. I enjoyed Risk as a kid, but I liked Monopoly much more. I felt like Monopoly was uh it was a faster paced, more intense game, whereas Risk could literally, Risk could take a couple of days to get through a game, if everybody was really committed to it. And I definitely like the speed chess vibes of Monopoly, where you were like, you're closing in on that kill, right? Like, you please land on my properties. I've got 10 hotels on them,
I
uh,
growing up, in a socialist sort of family, wasn't a big hit in the house. But yeah, one day I'll play Catan. So I know what's going to end up happening. A huge fan of it is going to send me an email after this drops, and he's like, "Oh, we got to go play Catan," and I'm like, "Yeah." It's not like people haven't offered to play the game. I just there's too many good games, which you're alluding to now. I mean, there's just too many. But so at what point? Because every gamer goes through this, and I make fun of our community quite a bit. Every game that comes out sucks. They can always do it better. You actually went out and made a game. How'd that start? How'd the
uh,
process, like, what was the day that happened?
well, I've been designing training and products for years. That's been my profession, like practical use, like designing real war games. Like a perfect example of like something that was really exciting for me to work on in the real world was here we've got these guys from one of the SEAL teams, and they're about to go do a deployment someplace, and they're not going to be going out as a full strike force. They're going to be going out with onesie or twosie guys paired with like the local nationals, and they're going to be asked to prosecute missions. So we developed a program at Haley Strategic that we called Decentralized Battle Space, and that was the whole thing. It was all role players. It was creating scenarios where the whole mission was to not shoot anybody, right? Because there was no question that these people had the capability to conduct like combat at a level of proficiency that exceeds anybody they were going to encounter where they were being deployed. But the outcome of that combat wasn't necessarily going to be in the best interest of the United States. So I started to think about training much more, and like it's much less about what you're doing and much more about how you approach problem solving. So when we made our first game, which was a video game, we actually prototyped the whole game using miniatures. We built like a bunch of levels using Legos, and essentially played the entire game on this giant connected sprawling Lego board. And the whole purpose of that game was I wanted to teach people that procedures and methodology are more important than perfect execution. That I wanted to make people solve problems without handing them the solutions. Unfortunately, my first game is almost I don't want to say impenetrable. It's a super acquired taste though, because it's incredibly unforgiving. And it doesn't tell you why you're making mistakes. It basically just destroys you.
You're talking about Black Powder Red Earth or another game?
Yeah, no, Black Powder Red Earth. Our first game it's on Steam. It's called Turn-Based Tactics, and it is exactly what I wanted it to be. And people either absolutely loved it or absolutely hated it. They thought it was unfair, and I was like, "Yes, you're a 4-man team going into a 100-meter area where everybody hates you. Like it is going to be unfair. Like you have to approach the game from the perspective that more like survival horror than you would like your standard tactical game where it's like thousands of options and all this other stuff. And I want to be able to customize my guy. And I'm like, that's not real world. And so I feel like that's a minutia that designers get lost in because it's something that's easier for them to understand, right? Like people get obsessed with equipment versus actual capability and tactics. So when we made our second game, Black Powder Red Earth 28 millimeter, we had done a bunch of prototypes of that again on the Lego board with the intention of maybe making another computer game. But the computer game took so long to make, and we were having so much fun with the tabletop game. We said we can do a tabletop experience made in the USA from soup to nuts. We can hit a space that doesn't really have a game like this, and do it in a way that we think is completely different than everybody else, because our focus is, my Bible for making this game and the people who worked on this game with me, the required reading before you could work on the game was FM 321-8, which is the Infantry Rifle Platoon and Squad. The Infantry Rifle Platoon and Squad Field Manual is one of the best manuals. Like any game that does infantry, as far as I'm concerned, should in some way, at a minimum, reference this thing and at least and understand the fundamentals that are in it, because it doesn't cover every detail, but there's so much in this that one manual that dictates how fighting other human beings with basically carbines and machine guns, how it works. And how it's always worked, right? Like infantry fighting is not super. It's not like this deep science, and it doesn't matter what kind of equipment you have. It's so again, people were really extrapolating. Every time I looked at a game, there's a million tables I have to consult, and there's all of this information that designers seem to think is important, but actually isn't. And that was the main driver for me, is when I'm making training, I needed to create something that people could understand and actually learn from. You're not just going to be better at the game. You're going to be better at problem solving and critical thinking when you're done playing it, right? In general, that just like going to a flat range and taking a carbine and learning the discipline to be able to do up drills or transitions or malfunction drills, whatever we're teaching you, the tool is just the tool. It's the mechanism to get you to develop your critical thinking skills, right? To get you to be a problem solver. So our game really focused on a very efficient rule system based on what we thought mattered and what we've seen mattered, in the past decade of working in this space alongside some of the best light infantry soldiers in the world. Weird little things. So we don't deal with things like handguns or reloads. Why? Because I've worked with thousands of people. I have yet to meet a single person in the past 10 years who's done a reload on an actual mission, because that's not how it works. You have enough forces on site to deal with the problem. And because the game is balanced to the degree that we've managed to balance it, where 90% of all games where you have two similarly skilled opponents typically come down to one or two models on the table. That's all built into it, right? We don't have to worry about that minutia. We sort of pile everything into a general idea of capability points, because capability points is how we think about like building a squad, like, hey, automatic rifleman carrying some kind of light machine gun, a grenadier, or some kind of designated marksman, a communications expert who maybe is doing drone stuff, and then like a team leader, and that's your five basic functions, right? Like it's like
Well,
you
I know one thing that I'm gonna have to get Jim, Mike, and Mark over at they teach at Fort Leavenworth to the war gamers over there.
cool.
Somebody actually read a doctrinal document.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean this
I,
is what all of the professionals use as their Bible, though. Like all
do
of
they
the
really?
really high level, absolutely, the highest level guys that I've worked with from like the tier 1 and tier 2 units in the U.S. Army literally quote this thing like it's scripture. It's an incredible manual.
Oh, I've seen it. Yeah. I used to teach tactics, and I would say, okay, here's your reading list, this and that. And at the end, after they know they've kind of passed and got their patch, I'm like, how many of you guys actually did the reading? Honestly. And not a hands raised. And that is true. It's what did the Russian admiral say? We write incredible doctrine. We just don't really read it. And but now these manuals are a little bit more prescriptive. I know from working on a couple of them, they're kind of interesting. But you took this concept and then threw it into a game. And for those who haven't seen the game, I want to get to the artwork in a little bit because I think the artwork it's striking. It's kind of like a comic book, which there is a comic book that you can get with the game. One of the things I think is interesting about the game is these are fictional forces. So you have a whole narrative behind your game. Why did you go that route and how hard was that to develop?
Well, when we started doing Black Powder Red Earth, we started doing graphic novels that were based on they were fictionalized versions, like near nonfiction works, essentially about stuff that was happening in Iraq at the time that we were working on. Um, those were meant to color some of the earlier games that we were working on. Over time, the graphic novels kind of took over for a while because they were, I don't want to say easier to produce, but they're more predictable to produce because given the input we were getting and the people we were able to work with, we were able to do these very striking works of predictive fiction that are ultra detailed. And when we where this game and this sort of setting specifically came from is pre-COVID, we had been working with Netflix Japan on a Black Powder Red Earth miniseries. And one of the big requirements was going to be that we create a fictional country because if you're going to make games and a lot of platforms will not let you make a game like a military game set in a real country. They'll actually won't let you put it in their store. So, publishers are thinking about, well, I want to sell an iPhone app or something like that, right? So come up with this fictitious country. Sorry, fictitious country is Albari, and then
You get extra points for making up words.
Well, Albari is a real place. It's in southern Libya. And then Khosra, which is its neighbor, is another real place. So we use the real cultures from those places and toyed with the history a little bit, basically bringing in stuff that happened in Iraq, stuff that happened in Afghanistan, stuff that happened throughout North Africa to create sort of the same level of complexity we would do for a war game. So we had these for a war game for the military. I mean, at Haley Strategic, like a customer would come in and we would have this entire package about the history, all of the different factions that are involved. And we did a more simplified version of that because I don't think everybody, people who are playing a war game don't care about the gross, the GDP and what's the crops that they grow. That's not necessarily going to play into what's happening here, but that was the kind of stuff we had been used to doing, and the world building is fun, right? We decided the graphic novels that you referenced, the newest series was worked on. It was the second or the third draft, I can't remember, based on Netflix first round of changes, which the first book was too much like our old stuff, which is kind of bolter porny, and then they wanted much more, different story, a little bit more intrigue, a little bit more of a thriller. So we went back and wrote that, and they said, okay, now you have to cut the combat in half because it's going to cost like $5 million an episode to produce the way you've written it. So they're like, okay, that's not good. And then you have the Albari series, which ultimately, from a game perspective and from an in-world perspective, is about the transition from a sort of GWAT counterterrorism foreign internal defense mission to an actual peer versus peer war. And when we made the game, we were saying things like, "Oh, you're going to see much more participation of private military contractors, not necessarily employed by like Western or even Eastern state actors, but like more employed by the local governments, essentially paid for by companies or front companies that governments would use to develop resources in a region, right? North Africa obviously has a ton of rare earth materials, so it made sense. Like as the Chinese expanded across Africa, we were much more concerned about them than the Russians. But we basically created a sort of proxy Chinese force that's composed of a mix of ex-Plan Marines, Syrian mercenaries, and North Koreans, because the North Koreans and the Syrians had worked together during the Syrian civil war. And on the other side, you have Crisis Troop Scorch, which is sort of a counterterrorism program put together by a energy company that is in this nation of Al-Bari, and that's composed of some Americans, but mostly Jordanians, Kurds, and Iraqi special operations expats. One of the sort of big things at the beginning of the story, in something we had called hypernotes, was that Iraq would eventually fall to Iran, and all the people who had worked with us there would essentially get evacuated by this company because they had worked with their guys during like Mosul and even in the formative years of the ICTF. I mean, a lot of our world building is actually based on work with guys who are actually Iraqis or Libyans or people who grew up in these cultures, to try to make sure that all of the world building was correct, that the scenarios would be realistic, that we wouldn't be just like coming out with some Jack Ryan stuff. It's really went the extra mile to make sure that the entire thing was as authentic as possible.
Well, so as you were developing the game, you have a miniatures background. When you approached the game, what were some of the things that you found most challenging in making Black Powder Red Earth? And what was things that were surprisingly easy?
Making maps became the easiest thing, and in the first game, making battle spaces was extremely difficult. Because you're dealing with sight lines and you're dealing with like 100-meter area, and we wanted the guns to work like real guns. So that means, there's no like artificial limitations where an M4 can only shoot 12 inches. Like if you can see it, you can hit it, right? Because at 100 meters, I mean, it really doesn't take a lot of skill to hit somebody with a rifle at 100 meters. So that was surprisingly easy. The most challenging part of the game by far was the phasing. And when we had the breakthrough with the phasing, when we got it right, and the activations, that was as soon as we got that, we knew we had the game we wanted to play, because we had done everything from activating fire teams versus individual units. We tried you go, I go, despite my initial distaste for it. We explored. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, when you were demoing the game, I tell you what, I thought that was the most interesting part. But and to me as well, as you were narrating it, I'm like, how the hell am I ever going to learn that? Which is something like, because your DNA is in this game, so you understand it, you know it, but how the forces interacted with one another, I thought it was very interesting. And as you said, it's a very unforgiving game. So if you move and you're in line of sight, you're going to get shot. Almost all the time. I didn't see any exceptions to that as you were demoing the game. I thought that was interesting. That must have taken quite some time.
Yeah, yes. Well, because I don't like the Overwatch mechanic as a concept. I feel like it's a crutch that people put into their games because they don't understand how to properly render time in turns. That's a little bit of an extreme position, but like it's something that's always bothered me. The concept of an immediate action and why it's debuffed, and why it's debuffed to the degree that is. I mean, the fact that we even use 2d10 versus like just a 20-sided dice, right? We are trying to minimize randomness so that players are able to make informed, good decisions. There is always risk in a decision, right? Nothing is an absolute, but the fact that the The fact that like you can try to draw fire from an opponent, you can force people to take actions that they don't want to take. That is at the very core of the Army Infantry Rifle Platoon and Squad Manual. Like, make the opponent make mistakes. Give like what is the thing? People can solve problems, right? Dilemmas are multiple problems at once, and you can't solve them all. That is at the heart of being able to do a lot of the maneuver stuff in our game, because an opponent might not wanna waste his activations taking shots at your guys as they're approaching him, but he also might not have a choice, because some of the units can be incredibly dangerous in this game. Like you said, it's unforgiving. I mean, the tagline of the game is unforgiving close combat. Absolutely what I wanted to depict. And again, having spent so much time working in that space and seeing what like even skilled guys getting torn up, you start to really understand. It's like, okay, the skill lays in the maneuver, right? Because at the ranges that most combat happens, which is typically inside of 150 to 125 meters at the max, it's not that hard to hit something, right? Like I was getting ready to go on a trip, and I never fired an AK before, and it was discussed that like, hey, in case you end up in a car with everybody dead, you should probably know how to use an AK, because you're not going to be able to pick up an M4. It's like, okay, fair enough. So I picked up an AK, and in 30 minutes, I was able to hit a target at 400 meters
Well,
consistently.
it's very easy to. I'll tell you what, it's a really easy rifle to use, and
Yeah.
it's probably why it's so popular. But understanding that games are abstractions.
Yes.
And there's a lot of stuff like I've put on about games we play within the DoD, for analytics and for educational purposes. But like one of the things that I always tell folks, oh, I got to get my hands on that, and I'm like, you wouldn't like it. You really wouldn't, because it's really going to test um, what you think you know, and looking at the abstraction. It's not really easy to take a game that is designed with the intent it seems like you had, and to make it a commercial success. Um, you know, Definitely not going to talk about numbers, but looking at that and the folks that are coming up to your booth and, hey, this looks interesting, because the game is striking. I have to say that the models look great, the table looks great. It's a striking game. Um,
Thank
like
you.
a lot of games, like when I would take OWS and show people how to play, yeah, they're kind of glad for the experience, but don't really like it because it wasn't created for fun. How did you guys overcome that?
Well, I think it really comes down to the playing the opponent versus playing the rules. And that is I think that's a refreshing thing. I don't think a lot of players I think a lot of players of tabletop games have a very high tolerance for extreme amounts of friction in their game experiences. And at Historicon, for example, I a bunch of folks enjoyed the BPRE demo and invited me over to their booth to try their game. So I did. Yeah, always interested in seeing what else is out there. Um, I found these other games, like, they were almost impenetrable to me. The amount of roles, what we were trying to compute for, what we were trying to like accomplish, and I think that like our game is a lot more intuitive, and because it's a little bit more intuitive, it becomes more fun, because what, like, I always say this to people, like, one of the reasons first person shooters are so popular with many gamers is because there's not a lot to learn, right? There's going to be nuances of the game and how you interact with the world, but fundamentally you know how to move, you know how to aim, and you press a button to interact with things, and that's pretty much the game, right? Like, that's the core of the experience. Everything else is layered on top of that, whether you go to point A, go to point B, whatever, right? Like, capture this position, blow this thing up, move this thing from point A to point B, whatever, right? Like, all action games essentially have those same sort of common components, right? Wipe out the enemy. Um, what makes our game fun is that you get immediately engaged in it, because there's not these layers of unnecessary abstraction. It's all been I don't want to say streamlined, but it's all been made into something that actually represents that moment to moment experience of actually being an NCO and being responsible for putting dudes in harm's way to accomplish an objective. And that is something that, at least on a tactical level, which are the games I enjoy the most, at a tactical level, games are constantly trying to add complexity to that, because they don't know, because the rest of the system doesn't actually represent what they're showing. And the example I always like to give is UFO, the original XCOM, if you will, is a game that I had a very weird relationship with, because the things I loved about that game were this sort of unforgiving fire and maneuver that was going on in the experience. But layered on top of this, I'm like individually commanding troops and a battlefield, but I'm also responsible for these massive logistic hubs and research and development, all this other stuff that doesn't seem to have anything to do with that. They almost seem like two different games. And I can enjoy a really good high level strategy game, and I do. There are games that I really love. One of my favorite.
You got to name
What, a
it.
high level strategy game? I loved. Oh God, I'm spacing on the name right now. God. They were the guys who made Rollout. What was it called? Supremacy. Supremacy was one of my favorite games.
Yeah, it's an interesting game.
Yeah. Have you ever played that one?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like, I remember seeing it at the store, and I had to save for like about 3 months of money back in the 80s when I saw it to actually afford it. But yeah, I remember getting it, and I was like so excited to play it. My parents wouldn't play it with me because it was too complicated, and it ended up being like another one of those games I played with the two or three friends in high school I had who enjoyed games like this. And that Supremacy was incredible. There was so much to consider. I mean, even we were talking about Catan earlier. Catan is actually an incredibly deep and sophisticated game, but it's very high level, right? Like, you're not dealing with the nuance of like the individual things. You're dealing with things that are very high level. So like, you're dealing with trade and harvesting resources and affecting influence in different areas. I mean, just so much going on in that game. But then on the other end of that spectrum, you have a game like Myth, the Fallen Lords, which was one of my first favorite strategy games because it didn't deal with any of that stuff. It was just purely a tactical level game, and it was really difficult. Like, really, except it was a game where if you didn't use all of the tools at your disposal when you're playing, you just got destroyed every single time because the game didn't care. Yeah, this is before they even had checkpoints and levels. I mean, this game would roll you over after spending an hour on the level, and you were just stuck restarting. Terrible. Oh God, I can't believe I played so much of that damn game.
I think right now I'm trying to see how much it costs if you want to get it, because it's
Supremacy or Myth?
yeah, a
Oh God.
Supremacy. How much? So I found one for 109.
Oh, that's not bad. I still have my copy. Actually, I never got rid of it.
Came out in 84. Board Game
Yep.
Geek, which is it's Board Game Geek. It's funny. People that hate the game rate it more than people that like it. So it's only a 5.7. Let's see if anybody's selling one.
That's
You
a
can
great.
get one for about $39.
Oh, that's a really good price. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think when it came out, it was like 40, $45. I mean, it was a really expensive game, right? Because it was a total niche clubhouse game where, like, again, I think I saw it at one store, right? Like, and it's funny, I'm looking at the cover they have here. I don't even have this version, which has all the nice illustration. Mine is much more bare bones. It's literally a blue box. It says Supremacy on it. It's got the map. Yeah, oh,
Yeah,
here it is.
I found that picture of it too. It's kind of interesting. Um, got to tell you, played it. Not a huge fan of it,
Hmm.
but it's still an interesting game. It's and here you have right away. It's like Great Beer and Pretzels game, albeit slightly flawed. It's from 18 years ago. Every once in a while you got to yank out one of those old games just to try it again. It's why I'm pointing at my copy, which everybody I'm sure could see, of Arab-Israeli Wars, and I refused to punch it. I went out and bought, the counters that somebody developed, updated for the game, and as soon as I got them, I'm like, you spelled half these words wrong. Really? I got yeah, yeah. You spelled chieftain wrong 3 different ways, but thank you. Anyway, the counters look beautiful, but yeah, I mean, going back to Black Powder, Red Earth, I think the story behind it to me is interesting. it's also something where, a lot of gamers often they don't care about deep narrative history,
Hmm.
but in fantasy games, if you notice, they all have that. This is what the Space Marines are. This is what, you know, for some people, that narrative story is really kind of important, but they don't want to seem like they're studying history. And then you have a lot of gamers that think they know history. It's one of those things. You made mention of cons, and we talked about cons before. And you read a pamphlet, 98% of the people that walk through, with those military t-shirts and hats, which I don't own any, by the way. uh, they've never read, and if they read it, they didn't understand it most of the time. And John, you know who I'm talking about out there, my buddy that lives in Fredericksburg. I know you've read it because one of the things too, and I'm going to beat up this game. Paolo is one of our writers. Is Command. It's a computer game, and they've actually sold it to a bunch of militaries. And they came out with an ATO creator. Well, I've done that, and I'm sitting there on a Saturday for 2.5 hours, and I'm like, this is just not fun. One of the things that and I think we talked about it. I'm like, a lot of the games we play are like porn. You're selling a fantasy to people,
Hmm.
and that works. And that's why Games Workshop does so well,
Hmm.
because it's kind of a it's I also call Risk dice rolling porn. It's just totally gratuitous. A lot of dice rolling. Um and there's something about some of those games. And then, a lot of gamers feel, well, if it's the rule book's thick, it has to be realistic. uh, Most people don't want to play a realistic game because, once again, they designers tend to overbake the rules. With your rules, and then from reading them, because thank you for the PDF copies,
Sure.
um, that they are intuitive. Um, you see that quick decision making that folks have to make, but in a way, it's quick. It's a bloody game, um, but it's that thing of being having it being fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at Nova Open, because I really want to sit down and actually play this. This is how this game kind of works. Um, Usually at cons, I'll watch other people play. I guess it's my voyeuristic streak, and seeing what kind of fun they're having and what they think about it. And even if it's a game that doesn't really jive with the part of history I'm in, there's something about that, watching people kind of get into the game really quickly, which it seemed like, because I know my friend Steve Toth from the oh, I'm gonna blank on the name of their podcast that they do for Blood Red Skies, Lead Pursuit. Sorry, Doug. Um, that he liked it. He's got too many games. I'm not going to go paint another army, is what he said. And I said, well, how many models? Because your game is not a high model count. How many
Yeah.
models?
So we currently have 4 boxes of models total. So there's 3 factions. There's Crisis Troop Scorch, which is sort of the more Western private military contractor force, and there's 20 total models for those. Well, 21 if you get the special the special Patreon limited edition of one of the models. And then for the opponent force, we have 2 boxes, one with 21 and one with 14. So you have a total of about 35 models there. We have an expansion coming out, which will have more models on top of that, but it's only another 11 models, I think, per box. So, uh, and they're for the most part unique sculpts too. I think we only for basically our grunt crit seeker units, we've reused some of their models, because when we were first starting out, we weren't what's the word, we weren't giving a crap about the budget. We were very much just focused on quality, like detail, pose, everything, getting as much right as possible. So essentially we figured, okay, with the sort of like the hordes, you don't really need to spend quite as much on those, given how much effort we've spent on everything else. So
Yeah, so
um
that was the question I was going to ask. So the models look beautiful.
mhm.
All right, so let's let's give a shout out to who was your model designer, and who did the artwork for these books and the game in general?
So the layout and the art in the books is done by myself and our staff artist Josh Taylor. The and he's been working with me for over a decade now. So I mean, it helps. We literally have all this equipment from working with it, so it doesn't require a ton of imagination from him. We literally will get everything on and do poses for him so he can see it all and be like, aha, that's how it's supposed to look, right? Like he's probably got a more robust pose library and equipment library of photos than any other artist alive who does this kind of work. In terms of the actual sculpting and ZBrush work, that artist actually prefers to remain anonymous, which is why we've never really called him out. He doesn't do work for anybody else but us, and he is at a job where he is concerned that, what's the right word? He is concerned that working on a game that deals with modern military stuff could cost him his job. So he does not. He does.
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a couple of people work on this game with us over the years and BPRE, and a lot of them, I'll give you a true example, a little crazy. I have a guy who's a medical illustrator. He was told to make white blood cells look less white. And when he got that instruction from his boss at the office, he literally called me up like an hour later and was like, take my name off the book. I was like, okay. that's kind of crazy. Like, that really happened? He's like, yes, take my name off the book right now. I was like, okay, got it. Because originally he'd wanted
There's
got
to be a backstory. There's got to be a backstory there, which I might have to hit you up for when I see you in a couple of weeks.
That's all I actually know about it. Like I never expected to get a call like that in my entire life. But that kind of answers your question. I forgot one other guy. We worked with an artist, Kai Lim. He used to work with a friend of mine in Singapore, and he also had done a lot of Imperial Guard illustrations that I really liked for GW. So we got connected with him, and he worked on some of our quote unquote like chapter art, like like if you're going through the book, like the big spreads. He did a couple of our spreads for us in our first core rules book, but he's busy working on his own game right now, so he didn't contribute to the phase line book, and he is 99% not going to be able to contribute to the new Spearhead book either. So so the artwork is pretty much entirely Josh Taylor and me, like laying everything out.
Well, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really have to say it is one of the things, and I was glad to meet you guys because seeing the game on social media, it does have sex appeal to it with the art, and I think sometimes a lot of companies they wanted to look if not to bash Warlord, but it's always pictures that you would see normally in Osprey. They're beautiful pictures, very high detail, or they're pictures of beautifully painted models. This one, because it kind of has a, fictitious but not pulpy feel to it, I think it really kind of sells it. It's really kind of one of the things that, oh, this is kind of eye catching, and I am pretty sure a lot of people just stop by just because of how that looks, because you had that huge poster behind you, and I'm like, well, what the hell's this?
That's not an accident.
I didn't think it was. Yeah.
I mean, one of our many claims to fame of like our near misses of success, if you will. The last Call of Duty Modern Warfare, when they rebooted it, when the game came out, they actually had forgotten to take all of our artwork out of the game that they had been tracing over. And we had to send them a cease and desist because you can look it up on the internet. They actually were like directly using our photos and our artwork and drawing their stuff on top of it. Because nobody does better authentic for what we're doing. Even in like the sort of like high end world, none of these guys have the level. They don't have the experience and the access that we do. I think I'm the only civilian that I'm aware of that basically got an abridged version of Stefartech, which is the Army Special Forces Urban Warfare School, and I got to go through it with night vision. So the the understanding I have of infantry fighting in buildings and in cities, especially at night.
That's the JSOC one, right?
Well, actually, Whiteside SF does it too. Sephardic is, I mean, it's Army Special Forces, so
Yeah.
not all of Army Special Forces, obviously JSOC, but
Right.
it's like the school, right? Like that's the urban warfare school, just like Ranger School is if you want to get your, you know, you might not necessarily get into bat, but like you got to go through Ranger School to even get a shot to get into bat, right? Sephardic is a similar thing. They send a lot of people there who aren't even SF guys, because it's such a good school, right? And I
And
don't think the Army really has anything else like it, if I'm not mistaken, other
it's
than like JSOC.
the one in North Carolina, though, right?
Correct. Most
Yeah.
of those schools are in North Carolina.
Yeah, because a friend of mine was the J4 for
Oh,
down there. So yeah, I got to go see it. It was pretty cool. So yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, and I could tell you one thing. And if you meet John at a convention, you have a passion for this. What are your plans now? Game's out. It's been out for what, about a year now?
we're coming up on we're like right about a year and a half.
Year and a half.
Um, yeah, and we're trying we have a new game coming out. Well, so
We
with
love
there
spoilers here. We love spoilers.
yeah, well, so one thing that's a little weird, different about our game versus I think other miniature war games is because I have that Space Hulk in my DNA.
Uh-uh.
I I'm not selling you a game where you have to go build a whole army once you have the core game, right? You might want to buy a couple of extra boxes depending on some of the other games because the models we give you are enough to play the core game. But when we did a second box, Phase Line built on top of all the components because the components were so freaking expensive.
Hmm.
We built on top of the components in the complete target package and created a whole new game type. But just like in FPS, the core mechanics work the same way. Movement's the same, shooting is the same, doors work the same way. There's nothing wacky that we don't change the fundamentals. We just change the objectives and how you achieve them. So just like playing like Capture the Flag or Headquarters or Deathmatch or whatever, each game, like the complete target package is literally an entire game. You don't need anything else. If you want to play a different kind of game, you buy Phase Line and layer it on top of that. So you can play then Phase Line or the raid, what we call raid mode in complete target package. Spearhead is a third entirely new, different way to play the game, and it has a campaign system that actually connects the raid and phase line and spearhead game types with all of the cards and all of the components we offer. So we haven't touched this, but the game is entirely made and sourced in the USA. Uh,
Which
and I literally mean everything. Like we didn't try any tricks at all. Like I've had very unpleasant interactions with other vendors where they sell their stuff and it says made in America or made in wherever, and then the owners proceed to tell me about how they're able to put that on there, but use Chinese packaging or use this or use that,
yeah,
and
and I think I asked you about that too. Like nobody's doing that just because of cost.
yeah,
Because
but I'm doing
eh,
that.
you are, and you know when I look at games, the game is expensive.
Oh yeah.
Um, you know, a lot of developers really want to go away from getting the games printed in China just through the shipping and logistics and
Hmm.
time. You know, I'm still waiting on, you know, because I talk to a lot of game designers, game companies. It's the effing supply chain.
Hmm.
Well, why don't you do it here? Do you want to pay $300 for this game I'm selling you for 80? No, I do not. So I'll wait. But just talking through that and you know with other game designers, I think everybody wants to make the switch. What made you decide to make that switch?
I mean, this is super easy stuff for me. There's videos of concentration camps in China where they are amassing and exterminating millions of people, women and children, and they are impressing them into forced labor to make all this stuff. I am not buying or making a fucking thing that leverages a Holocaust economy. I have been to Auschwitz. I never want to go back there. It's the
Yeah,
most horrible place I've been to in my entire life.
it's striking. And especially scary how big it was.
Yeah. And then
But
but then you
small town.
look You look at the videos in China, and they're operating at an industrial scale far beyond anything the Germans were able to do, or even the Russians when they were like murdering their own people. Um, I mean, China is our enemy. Let's be clear. I'm a Chinese. I'm a second generation or first generation Chinese immigrant here. Or my dad came over on a boat escaping communism. I have been to mainland China. I've been to Hong Kong before and after the switchover. I am not supporting them in any way that I can because I need to be able to go to sleep and look at myself in the mirror. I don't buy I know that it's impossible with electronics to completely circumvent China. It really is, but like nothing I buy says made in China on it. Like I stopped buying like Apple computers basically at a certain point because as much as I prefer them to Windows machines, I was able to build a Windows machine with components that didn't say made in China. They were all made in Taiwan or Singapore or Malaysia or wherever else, right? But like, and I'm sure that again, some of the transistors must have come through China at some point because I think they almost all do. But like, I didn't buy a new PlayStation when my PlayStation broke because once I saw that video, it's like I can't make excuses anymore, right? Like I see that as happening. And like over the past 4 or 5 years, I've I've basically taken everything that I can that's made in China and removed it from my life. And you know, I don't want to get into the I don't want to get into super deep politics here, but it really comes down to a moral thing. Like I come from a background where like your word is important, like your character as a man is important.
Yeah.
And like I would not have the respect that the people that I care about having respect from if I was making stuff over in China. Right?
No,
Like
I
that's a
mean
big
that's
deal for me.
once again, like I said, you're very passionate, and it shines through there. Yeah, it's a lot of people are looking to move their supply lines out of there.
Hmm.
One of the things that's if you want to do things at mass and scale here, we just don't do it anymore, which is something we could talk about when I see you at the Nova Open or when we start doing NDNG After Dark, which will be coming out in a couple of months. We're kind of working on that show. It's definitely going to have E rating there, folks. But no, I mean it's one of those things where look, you own a development house, you have to make those moral decisions,
Yeah.
and no one's going to castigate you. It's one of the things like I expected you to say because we didn't want, if we got a government contract, we don't want to get a Berry Amendment waiver. So the you know
No. No,
that's what I was thinking at first when I teed up the question.
yeah, it's a lot more deeper for me because like you know, when we pulled out of Afghanistan, a lot of people I know got murdered. And I use the word murder. They weren't killed. They were murdered. And it didn't have to happen. Like life is an important thing to me, right? Like I'm not a very spiritual person. Um and you know, we're getting a little into the weeds here, but like yeah, like every second you have is important, right? Like you don't get it back. So the
Yeah,
notion of stealing so much from people is not something I can live with.
yeah.
And
Well,
and I mean whatever. Like I said, like that's why I'm okay. Like it doesn't bother me when somebody says, "Hey, can you make your game cheaper?" And I'm like, "Nope, can't. Sorry." Like I mean this is kind of a we're kind of in a unique hobby here, right? Like G
oh yeah.
and for all the negatives people say about GW, I actually have a tremendous amount of respect for this company. They do like 90% of all of this stuff they make. I think only the printing is still being done in China. And everything else is in the UK. They make their own boxes, they do their own I mean, everything, right? They actually
Well,
spent all the money to build all that infrastructure there and create all those jobs. I mean,
there's a whole town in England. That's where Warlord is. That's where GW is. It's
yeah,
yeah. I next time I'm back in England, I'm definitely heading up there to go see those guys. But
but
yeah, I
but
mean
that
it's it's in this country we just don't do those things anymore, and I wish we would. And from talking to a lot of the European game houses,
mhm.
they're going within Europe now
Oh yeah.
to source their games. I think it's big in especially with the French,
Mhm.
with some of those game companies because you've seen some really great games coming out of some of these that used to be small. They're getting bigger game companies. So yeah, I find all that stuff really kind of fascinating. That the economics of our hobby. I also
Hmm.
used to tell, any single women between the ages of 28 and 40, if you go to a gaming convention, that it's a lot of guys with disposable income.
Yeah.
So that's our demographic.
Well, when you think about it, like when I was talking to somebody the other day who's he's more of a modeling guy than a gaming guy, and he's really into like Gunpla and things like that. And he was talking about the tabletop wargaming market specifically, and he's like, well, it's a bunch of young kids. And I'm like, no, young kids can't afford these games. This is a 30-something hobby. You have to
Yeah.
not only do you need like some basic skill with like paintbrushes and stuff like that, you actually need to be patient. Like this is not. I mean, this stuff was never cheap to play. I saw a podcast recently, or I don't know if you can say you saw a podcast. I saw one of these
We
videos that
carry
you.
our on YouTube, so there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I was watching the guy on YouTube, and he was talking about how when he first got into Games Workshop, they played Combat Patrol, not because it was necessarily the game they necessarily wanted to play only, but because all they could afford to play. And I'm like, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense to me, right? Like you can play Combat Patrol with like couple $100 investment. But like at the end of the day, like people make a lot of noise about wanting things to be better, right? Like they want people to be paid better. They want the environment to be taken care of. They want uh they want like like better jobs for their kids when they grow up. All of this different stuff that they want. The only way we get that is if people actually spend their money accordingly to make it happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, and you know, there's some patriotism here too, right? Like I love this country. I'm very passionate about the United States. I don't necessarily agree with everything the government does, and I certainly haven't been in love with any of our recent executive branch people for some time. But like, whatever. That's part of being in a functional republic, right? Like you don't always get what you want, and
I'll
you.
pass that on to the SecDef when I see him next week.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, you don't get everything you want all the time. That's fine. Um, but like, hey, man, I'd like to believe that like as individuals, we're responsible for our actions, and like if we acted in our own interests more often, we would get more of what we want or what people say they seem to want. And it it's I don't feel like it's a super hard to grasp concept, but like living with principles is much more difficult than saying you have principles. So I mean, and that that comes back to like bringing that back to what we're doing here, like why we
Yeah.
manufacture here, but even why we make a game to begin with. Like we at one point put out a statement when we found out we have a lot of people who like to cosplay Black Powder Red Earth because we have, even though we're a realistic tactical game, we've kind of got some like flair to the look, right? It's not just like multicam everything and fatigues. It's t-shirts and designer jeans for our assault force, right? We wanted them to look really distinct, and that is how do I put this. Totally lost for words here. Um,
Yeah,
so
and
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sure I'll come to you in a second, but hey,
Yeah.
at the No Dice No Glory podcast, we do get to altruism eventually. So thanks for taking us there, my man, and I do appreciate that. But so next, you said is yet another layer on the game. Are you going to keep putting stuff out for this game, or is there another game that we're going to be
Well,
seeing from you guys soon?
Well, Spearhead is the next game, and we've been really fortunate so far that our balance has really nobody's been able to break the balance in the game. We're making a very minor change to some of the machine gun units in Spearhead, but for the most part, Spearhead is going to represent a complete product at that point, from my perspective, and we're probably going to let it sit out there for like a year or so, let more people get into the game, and then see what, if anything, we need to tweak because it's pretty good the way it is. And I don't want to just keep making stuff for the point of making stuff, which is unfortunately, I think a lot of younger people they want like that constant infusion of new product. Whereas I'm much more happy if we have a perfectly balanced game and it's out there, and maybe we could look at bringing it into a computer format to expose more people. I think that's where I was going before, is that like this is a very niche hobby to begin with, right? So having stuff that costs a little bit more is almost to be expected, right? You're buying designer products here. Making them to the highest possible standard is kind of what draws me, and I think it draws like other people to this kind of stuff, right? Like, because for me to produce this kind of quality in a real-time 3D environment, you're looking at like tens of millions of dollars of investment and like big teams and all kinds of stuff to make it happen. With tabletop, the iteration is there. If people want to tweak the rules a little bit for their own games, they can, right?
Which is an
But
interesting point I always bring up to gamers, right? I
Mhm.
don't like the rule. I don't like the way this plays. And I'm like, look, the game designer's not going to come to your house and slap the dice out of your hands if you modify the game. And that was the other thing too, that I think you alluded to. I definitely want to tease out is, a lot of companies, their model is, let's be honest, these companies run at very thin margins.
Mhm.
And it's a reason why a lot of them are risk adverse, and I totally get that from talking to folks about the business side of this.
Mhm.
But there's nothing wrong with out there, fan made scenarios, fan made I f- what's the battle spaces as you put in your game. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's the beauty of a miniatures game. That look, every time you set up the table in most games, it's 100% unique. If you
Mhm.
had to recreate it, you probably couldn't, over and over again. That there's a point in time where you're an active participant in this experience. That's you, the die
Mhm.
roller, and you don't need all these updates and when's the next book coming out? Yeah, we ask because I know that's the question. Hey, you idiot! You didn't ask that one. You always ask that question. And plus, like I said, we love spoilers, but there's a certain point of time where you as the player, as the person that's painting these models and getting groups together, you can play the game however you want, and let's say something's in the game that you really want to play, there's nothing wrong with that. And it's that weird fine line between chaos and OCD that gamers have. And that's why I think as a gaming culture, I don't think we'll ever be happy with anything. So, it's I personally really want to, when I see you in a couple weeks, I want to play this, actually sit down and play the game, to kind of see. I thought some of the mechanics, you know, you pull them in with that big poster and the great looking models and the tables look great, but the game plays well. And I think it offers, when I say unique experience, I think it truly is a unique experience. Yeah, I know people are going to say, but every game is. Sure, it
Mhm.
is. But this is that much different, I think, from a lot of other games. Me personally, I don't do a lot of modern stuff for a host of reasons, which everybody that listens to this thing already knows. But if this is something I think that interests you, this is a game, in my opinion, it's worth checking out. And the next place folks can see you, I believe, is the Nova Open, right? In
That,
my backyard.
that's correct. We're going to be doing an event on I think it's the second Friday the second. Let me bring up a calendar. Though I
Yeah.
think the event just sold out again. We've been, we've done pretty well for the show. It looks like, yeah, it's going to be, oh, Friday the 1st. We're doing an event. We have a panel we're speaking on August 31st about indie game design. But yeah, we'll be doing demos the whole show. The whole show we'll
Which
be
is
doing
great
demos in the booth.
because the
And
Nova Open is not known for historical gaming.
yeah, well, and I don't know if we cross some lines there, whether we're historical or near nonfiction, if you will, near present conflicts. Um, but yeah, it's I'm actually very excited. I've only been to the Nova Open once or twice because I'm not a super big GW like player. So and it had in past been very much skewed towards the GW player.
Yes,
Understandably, right? That's the 800-pound gorilla. Like I've talked to one thing I'll tell you I've learned is I talked to stores when we tried to get more retail distribution. And I think many people, myself included, were a little naive about this. The reason stores don't carry more indie games is because people will not buy them, right? Because the game players are doing two things. They're collecting and they're playing. But for a lot a
Right.
lot of games, it's much more about collecting, like the concept of a pile of shame versus like I've told people, I'm like, yeah, I don't care if you paint your minis. I when I played Space Hulk, I didn't paint any of my miniatures, right? Like that was not something that was even available, to be honest, right? Like the ability for me to paint all my Marines up and my Gene Stealers. No, we just played with them. It was good. Like the colors were good enough. We could figure everything else out from there. Um, and I know that's like anathema to some people, but like
Yeah.
I want people to be good. I want them to build skill. Like I feel like
Yeah.
skill is a gateway to critical thinking, to being like better as a person.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's why that's why I design games. I think it's really different than other people because my motivations one of I love about models, having gotten back into them recently, is I missed making things. I used to make them when I was a kid, like in the days of Revell, when Revell was the absolute best stuff you could get.
Oh yeah.
Um, you know and I hadn't done that in so long, and when I started actually making models, it took me like 2 years to build up the confidence to even try to paint one. And the first one I made, and I'm a professional artist, right? Like the first one I made, I absolutely was like, oh, this is terrible, I'm just not cut out for this. And I didn't touch one for another month or two, and I was like, you know what, I have like 200 Space Marine models or Imperial Guard models, and I should I really like how they look in the picture, so let me give this another shot. And then I just got a better brush, and the better brush, I was able to do something I was very pleased with.
Yeah.
Certainly not Sam Lens quality, but like, hey man, it's a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm actually. People know this. I haven't painted seriously a collection in almost 2 years, and I swore to myself I was going to start tonight, but tomorrow I'm going to paint some of my black powder epic. To finally get that to the table, because if John Russell comes to my house again, I don't want that stack of unpainted minis there. And I even bought into a, a new small scale skirmish game by Fire and Sword. So I'm going to get back into it too. So, but where can they find the game
so
and your website?
Yeah, so there's only really two or three stores that carry our game. There's a company called Hangar 18 in North Carolina. Your Hobby Place is in Virginia and
Yep.
West Virginia, and then we have another store that carries our stuff in Texas and Plano called My Mini War. That's pretty much everybody else just picked up the game. They sold through their inventory, and then, as I was mentioning earlier, they just can't justify the shelf space because it takes too long to sell the games in many cases. And again, it's why when you walk into most game stores, the only thing you're going to see there is stuff that's safe, like 40K, which in many cases keeps most stores alive that they carry it, and then maybe some licensed stuff, like you might see a Blade Runner or an Alien, something safe, right? Like Shadowrun, when there was the video game. I know a lot of stores in my area carried Shadowrun, but then nobody bought the games, right? Like people just bought
Yeah.
they played the video game, and they never went to the tabletop. So really, the best way to if you're not near one of those stores, the best way to buy the game is just our website, and you can just go to 28mm blackpowderredearth.com, and it's 28mm if I need to say that. But we have a whole mess of stuff on our website. We have some limited edition graphic novels, some prints, T-shirts, FFI patches, and then a lot of our books are available on Amazon. So if you already have a million models and you don't need any more, you can just buy the rule book. We sell some of the components separately right now, like the cards and the radial effect template. But unfortunately, we used to sell a lot more of the components separately, but our prices have gone up so much in the past 2 years that it just didn't make sense anymore. So the best deal you're going to get with us is typically buying the boxes. I will say that Spearhead doesn't get a box. It's just going to be a rule book and 2 boxes of models. But once again, like the best deal you can get is typically buying like a collected edition from us, because it includes everything. And once you have all those components, I mean, you saw it at the show. We don't use cardboard. We use something called Sintra. So it's like a polymer, and it's it's waterproof. It's weather resistant. I mean, the stuff is designed for beer and pretzels play. If you dump a soda on the table, it's not going to ruin your stuff. Like even our cards are like soft touch laminated. They're basically this same process that is used to make an iPhone box is how we make all of our cards for our game, which means
the components are amazing.
Yeah, and they have to be because our gameplay is so fast, And this is how I explain to people. I'm like, hey, I can make this with cheaper stuff, but then you're just going to destroy it, right? And like, it's not going to be that much cheaper because the difference between premium and like mid tier when you're making in the States is, you're talking about fractions of a cent in some cases, like maybe like 15-20 cents more per item. And so go for the best possible quality because the demo set you saw. I mean, we've played easily 400 or 500 games with that set. We've done.
It looks great.
Yeah, well, it's because we literally use stuff that nobody else uses. We use, and again, the cost is much higher, right? Like I know the My Mini War store guy was making a card game and he loved our cards so much. He's like, hey, can you give me your printer's number? I was like, sure. He called my printer up and then he called me later. He's like, yeah, dude, there's no way I'm gonna do a game components with your guy. Like that's like 2 or 3 times what I was willing to spend for this. I'm like, well, you can't get soft touch laminated, made in America, sourced in America cards unless you pay that much money because this guy is great.
Yeah,
you once you touch the stuff, it's possible. And I know this is a little probably anathema to like collectors. You don't necessarily need everything, man. I went down that road. I was very successful in technology for a while, had a lot of money, and bought everything. Like I would get into a series and then literally buy everything, like going back like 20 years in some cases. So I've got like hundreds and hundreds of models and toys and books from these different obscure Japanese animated shows that I used to love.
And we talked about the OCD part, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. But that's common. Like, but I had the money and the time to be able to go and actually realize all that stuff. And, here I am at 50 years old. And do I love this stuff? Sure. But unfortunately, I don't even have room for it. Like half of it just literally sits in boxes because I'm so OCD. I won't even take it out of the boxes more than once, like everything is perfect and mint.
Dude, I know. Yeah.
So like a game is meant to be played, and it should be rewarding. It should be rewarding for you. It should be rewarding for the people you're playing against. I mean, it should help build friendships. And something we have with a bunch of our players is, hey, you're an older guy. Get your grandson into this. He plays Call of Duty or Battlefield or some video game. He's not interested in like a bunch of redcoats that look like like bad Gumby. Like melted Gumby toys, build something like this that he can see and relate to, and he'll learn how to paint. Like get him into the hobby on his terms.
Yeah,
he might eventually come to you, but at a bare minimum, you can have fun making cool little military models with your kids, your grandkids, right?
Well, I'm gonna have you talk to my soon to be 17-year-old.
I'd be happy to. There's a lot of streamers online who's like, there's a guy War Corgi. He's another mill guy. He loves tabletop games. He was a big Star Wars guy. He got Black Powder Red Earth. I mean, his son wouldn't give him the time of day with these things until he got BPRE, and he started playing Black Powder Red Earth 28mm, and he loves it. Like it speaks to him. And the coolest part about it all is we made something that speaks to younger people, but didn't give up any of the realism, right? Like we didn't have to put capes on everybody and make them superhuman. Like part of what makes this game, I think, attractive is how fast it goes, right? Like and that speed is a function of how lethal close combat is when you're dealing with committed people who are actually fighting. Because in my time working with the military and seeing like actual like drone footage of guys fighting, I've yet to see anybody drop their rifles and run from either side. I don't see people getting routed. Like that doesn't happen. Like what I'm saying? Like the stuff that's like, I don't know if this stuff happened in World War II because there's no there's no video record of it. But like in Ukraine, I don't see dudes like throwing their guns down and running away. Like they stand and fight for whatever reason, right? Like doesn't matter why they're there, if they want to be there or not. Like people don't just like throw up their arms and surrender. I mean, look at what happened in that steel factory. People literally fought till they were like buried underground fighting for their lives, right? Like that's the kind of resolve people have, especially when somebody's going to really kill you and you know what that means, right? Like forget about like everything else. Like just like you and your brothers or sisters, you're fighting and you know what it means to lose. So are you going to just throw your guns down and run away so that you can get shot in the back? No, like it's just a fantasy. Like that, it just doesn't happen.
Right.
You know? So
well, I could tell you one thing from this hour. People will definitely see your passion, and I hope that drives them and gravitates them, you know, to play this game, to come check it out at the Nova Open. I'm sure you'll be back at Historicon, but
mhm.
I tell you what, like, so this also happened on the last podcast I did from here. Most people know with my friend Maurice, whose Crisis 1914 game did well on Kickstarter. Yay! So for some reason, I'll eat something beforehand, and you know, coughing and this and that. But I said to him, I'm like, hey, I'm not going to do that much talking, and you're a perfect guest for that. So I appreciate that. But it's that passion. It reminds me, there's a Fallen Land, a post-apocalyptic game. I interviewed John Longren at Gen Con, and it was after the vendor stuff closed. They let members of I guess we would be considered press actually go and talk to some of these guys, and he was still in sales mode. And I'm like, okay, calm down. And that podcast was on a different stream that I used to do stuff for. I wish that was still around because you'll hear me tell him, dude, take a breath, take a breath. I already bought the game, dude. But I think it's that passion that should drive a lot of designers, and they all have it to varying degrees. But yours definitely is something I look. You've been listening for an hour and a half, folks. An hour and 20 minutes. This is a man who's passionate about his game, and I'm looking forward to playing it again. And I think you out there should try it too. Um, we gave you the website. Definitely, I am sure somebody in your extended gaming circle has thought about it, or maybe even has it. Go seek it out and go play the game, and tell us what you think. John, I don't think you're a hard guy to get a hold of, right?
No, I mean like we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're in the face. I'm actively in the Facebook group. We have a Patreon. It's yeah, we're pretty reasonable to get in touch with when it comes to like talking about anything. So
Yeah, I think I am on your Black Powder Red Earth um, Facebook group, and that's why I was excited to talk to you when I saw you, and I'm looking forward now to see you again because then we could talk about all the things we didn't talk about. Here, and like I said, I'm probably gonna do a live podcast from there, because you're gonna be with your hobby place too, right?
no, we actually have our own booth at the
You have
show.
your own booth.
Yeah, your hobby places are exclusive Virginia and West Virginia dealers, so they're going to be handling
Yeah.
all the sales for us. But yeah, I mean, basically, we'll be there. We'll be there all the time, and the event we're going to run is going to be, you guys, people can swing by, or they can come out, or they can even, grab us online. We're pretty easy, pretty easy to find.
Yeah, well, you know what they say about being easy, right?
Yeah, well, we also have standards too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's okay. That's what we have to check. But yeah, I'll be there too with your hobby place, John. Thanks.
Thank you
This
very
was
much for the
awesome.
opportunity, sir.
No, no. I mean, since I saw you last, my life's been uh, interesting to say the least. But I'm not a complainer because complaining is like doing nothing. But I look forward to seeing you, and please come back, especially when the the next book comes out, and we'll talk about that. And hopefully, I'll have a few games under my belt by that time, so I can ask better questions where I'm
Cool.
not choking to death. So I'm gonna once again, thanks, man. This was awesome. And I'm gonna turn it back to Sean in the studio. And you know what happens once we do that? We'll sit around and talk about you. That's the
Okay.
listener, not you, John, not you. But all right, back to Sean.
Thanks so much for joining the show tonight. Remember to follow us on Twitter at No Dice, No Glory, and keep the conversation going on NoDiceNoGlory.com, now featuring our own message boards. Have a great night, everybody.